Hi, and welcome to Module 1 of an Introduction to a Framework for K-12 Science Education. This module covers the framework itself and provides an overview of that framework. In this section, we'll expose participants to information about the development of the framework and also help to look at an understanding of the fundamental organization and intent of the framework. So why was the framework written? The framework was written based on these two guidelines for science education. One is to educate all students in science engineering, and the other is to provide the foundational knowledge for those who will become scientists and engineers. The framework is designed to really address the first of those two goals, to educate all students in science and engineering. And I think it's really important to understand that the framework was developed for all students and that there would be additional coursework, there would be additional material that would be covered in a K-12 setting that would be directed at those students who are planning to move on into college and career in science or in engineering. The committee who wrote the framework was a National Research Council committee. The framework was published by the National Academy, and the committee had a charge of doing a few things. One was about the core ideas or the core information students should receive. Another was to provide some guidance on implementation and if we're going to make a change in science, what that implementation would look like. They were asked to also articulate about how the content of science would intersect across multiple grade levels, at least 3 grade levels for each kind of main idea of science. And they were asked to create some examples of performance expectations so that it was clear that while this wasn't a standards document, that there would be guidance within the document about what standards might look like. They were also asked to look at the implications of the goals for science education, and I think that that's spoken to a little bit in the guidelines and that they're really only looking at one of the two goals, that they were asked to still think about the implications for things like science literacy, college preparation, and workforce readiness, even though that wasn't their primary focus. And then they were asked to develop a research and development plan so that there was a set idea for how to inform future revisions of the work. A prior NRC report called Taking Science to School had already defined 4 strands of proficiency that are interwoven into successful science learning. This report was used as one of the foundational documents that the authors relied upon in conceptualizing the framework. So the 4 strands that they had already articulated were knowing and using and interpreting scientific explanations of the natural world, generating and evaluating scientific evidence and explanations, understanding the nature and development of scientific knowledge, and participating productively in scientific practices and discourse. As we think about those strands and the guidelines of educating all students in science and engineering, we can see it's really important for the framework to provide a path for teachers to follow that won't just outline the content students need to know, but would also support students in successful learning based on these 4 strands that are a much more applied view of what science learning means. The authors of the framework, as they were writing, generated a list of guiding principles that they really felt are interwoven into the framework itself. The principles are based on research and theory, and they provide a foundation for the recommendations the framework makes about how to achieve meaningful science learning. The guiding principles are drawn from what's known about the nature of learning science, and they underlie both the structure and the content of the framework. And as we learn more about the content and the structure of the framework, you'll see how these are really built into it. The first is that children are born investigators. In Taking Science to School, the research identified that students entering kindergarten have a really sophisticated way of thinking about the world based on their experiences with the world around them. In our family, we always joke that our kids were learning about gravity when they dropped things from their high chair over and over again. In reality, that's not a joke. Very early in their lives, children are observing the world around them and learning from small natural investigations. While children may not have a deep knowledge or extensive experience, they do have complex reasoning and have their own ideas about what they see. It's important that teachers listen to what children have to say, even when they're incorrect, and then use that as a foundation to build upon. Early grades should include science activities that will build upon these ideas by sharing both content and by providing students the opportunity to engage in science and engineering practices. The second principle is focusing on core ideas and practices. By focusing on a limited set of core ideas, students are less likely to experience coverage of multiple disconnected topics. Often we talk about the mile-wide and inch-deep curriculum. By focusing on a limited set of core ideas and practices, students are able to experience deep exploration of important concepts, and they're given time to not only meaningfully understand, but also to actually practice science and engineering and reflect on their nature. This also allows for a more coherent view of science across K-12. The use of these progressions ties into the research on the difference between experts and novices. Experts have deeper understanding of core principles and apply them to new and novel problems. Novices tend to have disconnected bits of knowledge, which doesn't allow for the application to new and novel problems. By focusing on core ideas and practices, the students are able to be more like experts and not only have the ability to work with new and novel problems, but also have a more flexible and coherent understanding of science. Principle number 3 is that understanding develops over time. The framework uses learning progressions to address the need to develop a thorough understanding of scientific explanations of the world through sustained opportunities to work with and develop the underlying ideas over a period of years. This provides students a kind of map to mastery of the content and helps teachers to better conceptualize how to address and present topics at different grade levels so that they can build on prior understanding, support increasingly sophisticated learning, and allow for developmentally appropriate interaction with both content and practices. Principle 4 is that science and engineering require both knowledge and practice. While the knowledge of science is often specific to the individual disciplines, the practices of science are not only essential, but shared across the disciplines. It's vital that students are receiving exposure to both knowledge and practice. Engineering has a similar situation. There can be a wide range of knowledge required of engineers. However, there's a key set of practices that all engineers engage in while doing their work. Principle 5 is connecting to students' interests and experiences. In order for students to develop a sustained attraction to science and for them to appreciate the many ways in which it is pertinent to their daily lives, classroom learning experiences in science need to connect with their own interests and experiences. In order to support teachers as they build on prior interest, the disciplinary core ideas identified in the framework are actually described not only with an eye towards the knowledge that students bring with them, but also towards the type of questions they're likely to pose themselves at different ages. Framing the curriculum around sets of questions like this helps to communicate relevance to the student and really connect to their interests and experiences. The final principle, Principle 6, is promoting equity. Equity in science education requires that all students are provided with equitable opportunities to learn science and become engaged in science and engineering practices. Access to quality space, equipment, and teachers to motivate learning and engagement is key, as well as adequate time spent on science. In addition to this, it's important to connect to the interests of all students, including those from diverse cultural communities. The difference between the exposure, prior knowledge, and interests of rural and urban students is immense. Also, the natural engagement in the practices can vary widely in different cultures. For example, in some cultures, questioning elders is frowned upon while storytelling is praised, while in others, questioning is acceptable but telling personal stories is not. Supporting all students can require embracing many types of diversity. In the reflection for this module, you'll be asked to think about which of these principles of the framework would require the greatest shift in your own personal instructional style. So that's something to kind of think about as you get ready to engage in that reflection. What will need to change the most for you if you're to embrace the 6 principles of the framework? The structure of the framework is based on the guiding principles, and as a part of that, the framework was created with 3 dimensions. These dimensions broadly outline the knowledge and practices of the sciences and engineering that all students should learn by the end of high school. The 3 dimensions are the disciplinary core ideas, which is basically the content of science, the science and engineering practices, which is the practice of science, the cross-cutting concepts, which are those principles that underlie all of science, like cause and effect. This course will separately address the content of each of these dimensions. While the framework separates these dimensions into chapters, in order to facilitate student learning, the dimensions must be woven together in standards, curricula, instruction, and assessments. One of the charges given to the committee was to create example performance expectations. The integration of the dimensions is illustrated in the performance expectation samples included in Chapter 9 of the framework. Student performance is therefore always supported by demonstration of mastery of all three dimensions integrated together. If we go back to those four strands from the beginning that we talked about what it means to learn science from taking science to school, we can see a direct relationship between those and the three dimensions of the framework. In fact, within the framework, the authors articulate how each dimension is designed to deliver on one of the commitments outlined in those strands. So we see that strand 1, knowing, using, and interpreting scientific explanations of the natural world, is wrapped into the disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. Strand 2, generating and evaluating scientific evidence and explanations, is accomplished through the practices. Understanding the nature and development of scientific knowledge is wrapped through both the practices and the cross-cutting concepts. And participating productively in scientific practices and discourse is accomplished through the practices. In the reflection for this module, you'll be asked to think about your impression of the three-dimensional view of science and whether you feel this is an accurate view of science teaching and learning. This quote is why we're starting our science course with an overview of the framework. And that says, ultimately, the interactions between teachers and students in individual classrooms are the determining factor in whether students learn science successfully. Therefore, or thus, teachers are the linchpin in any effort to change K-12 science education. So if teachers are the linchpin to the success of students, then providing teachers with a solid foundation in the framework will get us off on the right foot.